No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Why do people commit themselves to the things they do? Why are people so worried about sport? Why wine? Why video games? I'm Brian Lowry, and in this season of my podcast, Know What You See, I'm asking a simple question, but a really big one. What's the point? In conversations with people with a variety of passions and obsessions, we get the chance to look through a window and see what it means to truly focus on a realm of human experience. Join me on Know What You See. New episodes begin November 26th.
Hello, friends. This is No Small Endeavor. You're listening to our unabridged interview with Nancy French. We're talking about her recent memoir, Ghosted, subtitled An American Story. As I say in the interview with Nancy, I think my response to Nancy's book is just to say, whoo, goodness, that is that is a lot. And I actually, to tell you the truth, reading her book, I didn't know quite what to make of the interview that I was about to go into. But Nancy and I had a lovely time and a lovely conversation. And I think this is just a fascinating interview that I hope that you will enjoy and find as fascinating as I did. Enjoy. This is Nancy French. We are most delighted to announce that we're taking No Small Endeavor on the road this April. We'll be bringing our acclaimed variety show to cities across the country with special guests like Malcolm Gladwell, the New York Times bestselling author of The Tipping Point, and award-winning musician and songwriter Drew Holcomb, along with a killer band from Nashville. It will be a most outstanding evening of music, conversation, and big ideas. We'll be in Indianapolis, Louisville, Grand Rapids, Baltimore, Greensboro, Columbus, and Reading. I would love for you to join us. Details and tickets at nosmallendeavor.com/events. Again, that's nosmallendeavor.com/events.
We, the people, shape our country's story. America 250 is gearing up to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of America's democracy by collecting and preserving diverse stories from across the nation. Nominate any living person you think has a story to be preserved and celebrated for generations to come. Help tell our American story, every unique version of it. Visit america250.org/nominate to submit.
Nancy French is a 5-time New York Times bestselling author. As a ghostwriter, she's written for a variety of people, from Republican politicians to reality TV stars. And as an award-winning investigative journalist, she uncovered sexual and spiritual abuse in America's largest Christian camp. Today, we're discussing her most recent book, her personal memoir, Ghosted, An American Story. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's nice to have you. We know so many people in common, and first time to sit down together. So.
I know. This is so fun.
Yeah, it's very nice to see you and have you with us today. I must say, after reading Ghosted, I think I would summarize my reaction by saying, whew, that's a lot.
There's a lot in there. It's almost difficult to even discuss because there's so many different types of stories with different tones and different qualities.
And so much of it sometimes just overwhelming and kind of freighted with a lot of emotional weight. So what was it like for you unpacking your story in that way in this memoir?
It was actually horrible. I am so glad that I did it, but I've written so many books. I've probably written 30 books. And I thought if I sat down and wrote my own that it would be pretty easy. I could just breeze through. Like one book that I wrote one book in 24 days. That was a New York Times bestseller. Like I'm so fast. So I sat down to write this and it just decimated me. It was so difficult. I couldn't figure out what was important. I couldn't figure out what to leave out. I couldn't decide if like this story was charming or if it was alarming. It's like I lost all of my professional acumen.
Yeah. In the bit of reading I've done about memoir writing, one of the things that I've seen come up a number of times is that the author must choose some sort of governing metaphor or lens through which their narrative gets told. If that applies to you, what would you say the governing metaphor or metaphors are? or the governing lens was of what you chose to include or not include?
Yes, that's an interesting question. I've heard it described as reaching into a like a silo and grabbing grain and just pulling out a few. So I feel like the governing principle was what it was like as a Christian person when the various tribes of people that I thought should embrace me did not. Or in the tribal situations, and I say tribal, like your groups, your church, your whatever, your neighborhood, your region, when you were with them and they loved you until they didn't. So the name of the book is Ghosted, and it's sort of like, there's a lot of meanings to it because, you know, how the kids these days say that, you know, like if you don't return someone's calls because you're no longer interested, you ghost them. So it's that, but it's also, well, I used to be a celebrity ghostwriter, so I was a ghost, but also the Holy Ghost, because I feel like my story is ultimately one that God wrote, and I just wanted to tell it as truthfully as I could.
It seems also there's the sort of ways in which the ghosts of some of your very painful childhood experiences also stick with you through the story as well.
That's right. They're here with me today.
In your first chapter, Rough and Ready, a description of it's your father's family on Monteagle Mountain here in Tennessee, which is about an hour and 15 minutes east of Nashville, down I-24. Beautiful place. I've spent a lot of time up there myself. But kind of describe how you see that part of your experience informing who you are, or maybe better, let's come at that from a different angle. Just describe for us some of those pictures that you draw there of that family that you come from.
Yeah, so my clan they're hillbillies, self-identified hillbillies. They have Cherokee blood. My grandmother was half Cherokee. I loved them so much. I love them so much. They're beautiful women. The guys were interesting and intimidating and horrifying and kind. Like they'd, wrestle your hair and you would think, this is a gigantic human being. And his, overall, I had one uncle that looked like a hillbilly celebrity because he would wear like overalls and like a red shirt and like sunglasses. And, I was like terrified of my family and I loved them so much. Only like scared of the guys, but it was sort of like, I was intimidated because it was so different from everything that we knew. Because my dad, when he was 15, he got off the mountain by lying about his age, creating a fake identity, and joining the Marines. And so and by the way, that's so cool. Like my dad is so cool. And then he went back to the mountain after serving 3 years in the Marine Corps. And went to high school, finished his high school. He played football at the football team. He's like, that's just
wild.
Weird. Yeah. So I just appreciated my family so much, but I didn't have access to them like I wanted because my dad had become a Christian. He'd gotten off the mountain, became a Christian, and raised us in this teetotaling way. We were members of the Church of Christ. And so we did not smoke, drink, or chew, or hang around people who do. And so those people who do were my actual family. So I didn't have access to them, but the people on the mountain were beautiful souls. They had something about them that was so alluring and captivating. And the thing that captivated me is that my aunt was a psychic, which was absolutely forbidden. This is not what you're supposed to do. But I just found it fascinating. So I would sit in her lap while she would read people's fortunes. And she had the cards, but she had an actual crystal ball, which, in our normal Church of Christ ways, we would have nothing to do with. But on the mountain, you can't very well just like disown your aunt. So it was just wonderful. And I loved all of it. I loved their Cherokee dances. I loved the crystal balls. I just loved it all.
Yeah.
And I looked like them. My person and like my face, my hair, my eyes, I looked like my aunts. And I just thought they were the most beautiful women in the world. They would smoke these long cigarettes. They had makeup that was caked on, blue eyeshadow, just gorgeous, charming women.
It seems like there's this sort of tension between a sort of idealized toughness and yet at the same time, it's sort of dysfunctions of violence in the story there.
Yeah, I'm describing it so glowingly now, but bad stuff happened on the mountain. And probably to this day, there's a bifurcation between the people who are like the Swanee students, the wealthy people who go and have like, Teslas, and then the native people who live there, my family. There was just a lot of violence, I was intimidated by people for a good reason. People got beat up, including some of the women in my family. Legs were broken by some of the men in the family. People were shot. I had cousins that one cousin shot another cousin's arm off. I had another family member who was shot in the back while pregnant, died, baby lived. I mean, just lots of drama. So you can understand why my dad did not allow us to hang out there a lot. Everyone sort of calmed down as they aged, I think. And I love them so much, but it was a very dramatic family.
Yeah. How would you say that those influences and those stories have lived with you for good and for ill?
My aunt, when I was sitting in her lap looking into the crystal ball, told me
that's the first time that's ever been said on one of our interviews.
Right. It's so weird. And so she told me, she goes, Nancy, you're a seer. You're just like me.
Huh.
And that was intimidating because, first of all, you're not supposed to be that, whatever that is. I know the Bible says no to that, at least according to what I was taught. And so it intimidated me, but when she said it, it resonated in my soul. And so I believe that there is something to it. And one of my cousins that I write about in the book, he was, I just love the guy so much. I invited him to the house for a book party for, like my parents were there. We had all these elders at the Church of Christ, and he had never been to my house in Franklin. And so he called me and he was like, "Is this your house? I cannot come in." And I was like, "Why?" And he said, "Well, there's something." He goes, I just can't do it." And he hung up. And I was like, "What the heck?" So I go out there and he's sitting there with his head in his hands. And he is halfway in and halfway out of the car. And I was like, "What are you doing?" And he was like, "Can you not hear those voices?" And I was like, "What voices?" "No." And he goes, "I hear the voices of the Confederate soldiers." "You can't hear that?" He goes, "They are crying out." And I was like, "No." And I'd listened. And so we just sat there and had a moment, like 5 minutes, while there's a party. I was hosting a party and I was outside listening to Ghost. And I couldn't hear them, but, all of Franklin is a battleground.
Yeah.
So we came inside, and my cousin and my other cousin, they came in and they start, doing like predictions for people. Like, "Oh, you think you're going into the Navy? You're not." Or, whatever. It was just like the weirdest thing, but I just love them so much.
Yeah.
And I was so thankful to connect with them because I had to call them to remind myself.
Of the stories.
Of the stories,
Right.
But which was slightly awkward because it wasn't like we were in constant contact all these years.
So go back to that when you said you're sitting in your aunt's lap looking into the crystal ball, and she said that you were a seer, and you said that in spite of the fact that you know you're not supposed to be a seer, that it resonates with you.
Yeah.
Why? What about that resonated with you?
I think I wanted to be special, to be completely honest. I think there's probably it's that crass.
Yeah.
I wanted to be cool. And I thought they were cool.
Yeah.
But over the course of my life, and I have to admit right now that no church has ever invited me to come speak about Ghosted. So I'm no theologian. And there's probably a reason that they haven't invited me is because I do not understand God. Okay, that is the bottom line. I do not understand. But I've had these interesting experiences throughout my life where God has shown up and done honestly odd things, inexplicable stuff. And so I decided in my book to just include them. Dreams and things like that I think a lot of people have in their minds, like, "Oh, I had this weird thing happen. I don't know what it was." So I just decided to document it, and I thought maybe writing it down would help me understand it, but it hasn't really. But I just know that God is so fascinating, and he does all of this stuff. And I feel like maybe our perception of him, our rigid perception of him not being able to, I feel like it at least my theology, my upbringing sort of inhibited me from seeing God, but God just sort of reached through and it was like, okay, here we go. No, we're going to do this. This is the way life is going to be with me, and it's going to be different than what you thought.
Yeah. So you, early in your storytelling, you begin to point to the way in which your family's church context formed you in a very strong so-called purity culture. Describe for those who may not know what that means or feels like, what that entails.
It's a teaching that is grounded in truth that, sex is best experienced in the context of marriage. And I think that's true. But the kernel of truth is extrapolated so far that it's very damaging and toxic. So, for example, when I was in the church as a kid, we would have the girls' class and the boys' class, and the girls would have meetings and we would talk about sex. And I loved that because the only way I knew about sex was through Cosmopolitan magazine, which I secretly bought at Walgreens. So I was all about it and wanted to learn, like, okay, what does the Bible say about sex? This is going to be interesting.
I feel like I must interrupt you just a moment and say I also was raised in a similar purity culture. And I would say that I oftentimes found myself sneaking peeks at Cosmopolitan magazine in the drugstore as well. And I think I've never told anybody that until just now. Yeah.
Do it nationally. I love it. Well, that magazine had all kinds of stuff in it, sexual tips and stuff. And I had no business knowing about all that. But, there is an opportunity for the church to teach you like the right parameters for it. But what they would do is, I remember this so distinctly, and everyone that I've talked to who was raised in a similar situation has a story like this. The details differ slightly. Yeah. So some people might say they passed out brand new pennies, and then they had an old grungy one, and they were like, which penny would you rather spend? And it's like, well, they're probably equally valuable, whatever. Anyway, but mine was a rose. So they would pass around this beautiful rose, and they would say, smell it, and feel it and experience it and whatever. And by the time it went through all the girls in the class, it was all nasty looking. And I remember so distinctly, they were like, you are this rose. If you are sexually immoral, you are going to be damaged. And she dropped it and she squished it into the ground. And it was like, this is what you're worth. If you make bad decisions sexually, nobody's going to want to get near you. And it's just, that's not only is it terrible and toxic and weird, it's also antithetical to the Bible, to have one sort of sin that is elevated above all others. It's like sexual sin is so much worse than, for example, gluttony. You'd have all these big fat preachers preaching to you about, you better not sin in any way or you're going to be tossed aside, sexually. It was weird.
Yeah. Yeah. So then this clearly informs your later on own sense of shame with regard to a difficult experience you have as a teenager in the church?
Yes. Eventually, I stuck with the church when I was 12 or 13. I was in vacation Bible school, and there was a guy who was in charge who was actually a preacher at another local congregation who abused me after vacation Bible school. And it just messed me up for a very long time because it messes up your relationship with God to be abused in the church context. So I already probably had a weird relationship with God because I had all of these other factors going on. And then this happened and it really just exploded my life because I believed everything. I believed in everything they taught me at church. So what do you do with this?
Yeah.
If then that guy would preach about sexual purity too, to give you an example of how egregious it is to have somebody who's literally abusing you get up at the pulpit and talk about sexual purity. It is too much to ask a person to survive that.
Yeah. How would you say that in subsequent years, what are some of the key chapters in you coming to terms with that?
I am coming to terms with that now. But I think I started coming to terms with it. Most people who are abused as children don't really admit it until their 40s. And that's when I started sort of thinking about it more clearly and like trying to figure it out. Because previously it sort of bubbled underneath the surface and it would emerged through honestly weird reactions to stuff. And so I just needed to figure it out. And so I went to counseling thinking it was about a different subject, and then realized quite quickly that that's what it was about.
Yeah. I think you said in the book that he was later arrested for rape.
I was told that because he attempted to rape several people in my congregation. I later realized several. But the church elders and the preacher went out to the victim's house and convinced them not to call the police and that they would handle it internally, which means they did not handle it internally. And he went to coach girls basketball at a public high school in Kentucky until I was writing this book and realized it. And I drove my butt down to this county in Kentucky and had a meeting with everybody. And he is no longer teaching, but it was not a, I am woman, hear me roar moment, because I walked in there and I immediately started crying. They did not believe me. They mocked me. But by the time I finally got down there physically, I had a stack of evidence, names, numbers, stories of other victims, and I just left it there in front of a cop. I also invited a cop to attend. And I was like, here is your stack of information. If you want to call any of these people, they've agreed to be interviewed about what your basketball coach did to them. And he, quote unquote, voluntarily retired by the end of the week. And later I got his teaching license revoked. But the whole time they were horrible to me and made fun of me. It was weird. It was like I came from Tennessee and it was like I'd flown down from New York or something, like this out of towner. What does she think she's doing, telling us how to operate our school?
Yeah.
But
so then you subsequently get contacted later by Gretchen Carlson at Fox News.
Yes.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah. So I became a ghostwriter, celebrity ghostwriter. And at some point my paths crossed with Gretchen Carlson at Fox News. And she emailed me. We kept in touch because I was watching with awe as she helped hold Roger Ailes accountable. And so I would just send her emails of encouragement, and she would send me emails of encouragement. And then one day she emailed me and she goes, there's a camp in Branson, Missouri called Kanakuk Camps. Have you heard of it? And I had not heard of it because the Church of Christ only goes to the Church of Christ youth camps, which are awesome. And where I was baptized. I loved my church camp experience, but Kanakuk Camps in Branson, Missouri has an NDA problem, she said, a non-disclosure agreement problem where there's been a lot of sexual abuse and they have hidden it through NDAs. And she goes, will you look into it? And so my initial reaction was absolutely not. I don't want to even know the word pedophilia, let alone have to dwell in that. But the more I looked into it, I realized that the camp, there were hundreds of victims. There are multiple predators. I actually, over the course of 3 years, discovered that I was told of 16 suicides of the campers, one suicide of the predator after he was caught. Lots of carnage, lots of death. No one's been held accountable at the camp. The camp, what my investigation revealed was that the camp leadership was aware of egregious sexual abuse, abusive behavior by the predators, and they ignored it and just passed the people on to either different churches, different areas of the camp, did not call the cops. So they're responsible, but they still run the camp, and 25,000 children are going to go there this summer. So I started investigating that. And the reason why I did, even though I dug in my heels and I told everybody that was listening that I would not do this, I was convicted, I think, by the Holy Spirit, because in my church, when I was abused, the people knew that this guy was nefarious and they did nothing to protect me. And here I was, a grown woman, knowing that these children are at risk. And I was thinking the same thing. I do not want to get involved in that. I've never been to Branson, Missouri. What is why do I have to do this? But when I realized that I had the same posture, which I think was a terrible posture to ignore evil when you know it is bubbling under the surface, I realized I had to do it. So I said, I'll give it a month. It took me 3 years, and I proved everything that I intended to prove and much, much more. Published everything. One of my articles my last one was on the front page of USA Today, but the church's reaction was a collective yawn. They were not incredibly impressed by my investigation. They love the camps where their kids got to know Jesus. What am I trying to do? Get rid of this wonderful place where people come to know Jesus, that kind of thing. And so it's like people have nostalgia in their heart and they can't see what I'm saying, even though it's all documented. There are people in prison, like a lot of people in prison. Just the people that are responsible for the camp have never been held accountable, and they're giving their children to them. So I'm pretty despondent over it. I don't think I'm ever going to get over that for the rest of my life.
When did you start publishing those stories?
I think 2020. And it lasted maybe 2 years of publication. I think my last one came out in 2022. That was the USA Today one. The Dispatch published several. The Springfield News Leader and near Branson, they published several. So I'm pretty much done with it. And hopefully, there's no good spin on it. I mean, I'm very thankful that I got the word out. I think I allowed several victims to be heard. And to feel seen. I mean, there was one guy in Louisiana who sent me a video. I'd never talked to him before in my life, didn't know he existed, but he sent me this video and he was like, when I was 8, I was abused at Kanakuk. I told my parents. They did not believe me because the guy was so magnanimous, so magnetic, so amazing. Until today, when I read your article and I sent it to my mom and she's coming over tonight. And
Wow.
They made up. They'd had this estranged relationship. I've heard that over and over. So I would do it again, but
Yeah.
I was very sad about the church's sort of lack of response.
And then this began to also take a political turn when you were speaking out some about the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, and you were called upon by a reporter at Time magazine, and you recount how in that interview you say at one point, as a sex abuse survivor, you're marginalized your whole life, like no one is listening to you. And then that yielded all sorts of other kind of cruel responses to you in its wake.
Right. No, and that's like an innocuous thing. I wasn't saying anything about Brett Kavanaugh, right? Because the hearings weren't over. She called me in the middle, and I just happened to be like bawling in this weird emotional space. And I answered the phone, and it was this Time magazine person, and I said this thing that was innocuous, and it was from the heart. But the conservative media pounced on that. And because I'd written about my sex abuse in the Washington Post in 2016, and because we had staked out a position politically of not supporting Donald Trump, they were not about me. And so when I said that about Brett Kavanaugh, they said, why should we listen to someone who had sex with her pastor? Why would we listen to someone who seduced her pastor? Now, remember, I was 12 or 13 when a grown preacher abused me. It was the most evil response I had ever even conceived of, that people would side with the pedophile. But that is what I experienced, that the conservative pundits, that's what they did. I mean, that's definitely what they did. And I think something happens to you when you start having to defend a sexual predator for president. You maybe start loosening your otherwise the moral restrictions. I have no answers, but that's what happened. And to this day, I get harassed for having been abused as a kid in Vacation Bible School Church. It's weird.
I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you.
So another significant thread through your book is along with grappling with that sort of sense of alienation or being in exile with some of your church experience, you've also got this story of exile with the Republican Party. What would you say are kind of key turning points in that story for you?
I loved, my first political memory was of Ronald Reagan. I loved the man. I came home from kindergarten. I saw the inauguration. I thought it was a coup because I only knew about politics through fairy tales. And I thought, well, our king is being supplanted. This is horrible. But then when I realized that democracy was awesome, I loved Ronald Reagan, and I would cut out his picture from the newspapers and I would put him on my wall. And I went through most of my life, very, very conservative. Loved me some Rush Limbaugh. I mean, he had a TV show. I don't know if you remember this. And I would tape it on VHS and come home and watch it.
That's hilarious.
I know, as a kid. Like, what is wrong with me? But one of the reasons why I loved that was because my dad he worked for a paper company and he cut down trees. And I thought that environmentalists were just nuts. Because trees are America's best renewable resource. What is your problem? And so you have someone like Rush Limbaugh who makes you feel like the media had you wrong, like we're valuable. So I loved Rush Limbaugh, went all the way, probably, I guess, then I met and married this guy named David French, who you may know. He writes for the New York Times. He's a conservative columnist. And so we were the same. But then in 2016, when Donald Trump came down the escalator, I was still the same, but everything else around me had shifted. Like I was still the same person who loved Ronald Reagan. So if you love Ronald Reagan, you probably don't or shouldn't love Trump because there are different things happening. But that made me about as popular as head lice. I would always say to people, I don't support Donald Trump because I'm too conservative. But the label with the big L, liberal, has been stuck to me for years because I refused to bow the knee to Donald Trump, which is the most laughable thing in the world, that David French and I are super libs. You can appreciate that. But that's how it fell out. So now I'm always being called a liberal when in actuality, I don't feel like I've changed that much. I've changed a lot. And one of the ways that I've changed a lot is I'm completely dejected and sad at what is happening.
Yeah. Actually, the last time I saw David was at this table and interviewed David and Russell Moore that day. And when that episode came out, we heard from more than one listener who responded and they expressed appreciation for the interview, but they said, at least two people said to me, we wish that David and Russell had shown more introspection with regard to examining perhaps the ways they had contributed to the problem as it developed. So I'm not asking you to respond for them, but what would you do with that kind of feedback from somebody yourself?
Oh, I confess. I was the problem. I contributed to the problem. I exacerbated the problem. I enjoyed.
Hey there, friends. If intellectually honest conversations pique your interest, or you simply enjoy having your mind changed, then you should check out The Gist, the longest running and chart-topping daily news and commentary podcast. Hosted by journalist Mike Pesca, who frequently appears on MSNBC and the PBS NewsHour, The Gist covers everything from breaking news and politics to sports and entertainment, all from Mike's pragmatic, centrist point of view. Not to mention, you'll hear from guests like former Obama speechwriter Ben Rhodes, Massachusetts Congressman Seth Moulton, and Academy Award-nominated actor Jesse Eisenberg. My favorite part, after most interviews Mike conducts, the guest says something like, "Whoa, you actually read my book." So go ahead, follow The Gist on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now.
I made the problem worse and I loved it. I got paid for it. So I am confessing it. I was a person, I would sit at Fox News studios. I would be off camera. My clients would be on screen and I would think, oh, there's a better way to say that could really own the libs. You could stick the knife in and twist it if you use this word. Because my spiritual gift, not listed in 1 Corinthians, is acrimony and sarcasm. And I use that so well. And I would help people make America drink liberal tears. And then I realized, and I love my clients. I love I love all of my clients. But to give listeners an example of what we're talking about, I lived with Sarah Palin in her house. I did 3 Palin books. I worked for Republican governors, senators, organizations, pundits, anybody who was Fox News famous. I was their person. Because I just had a lot of fun. Because my whole life, I had been prepared for this moment. I knew Rush Limbaugh. I knew how to do all this. And then when Donald Trump came down the escalator, I was like, wait a minute. I thought we were sort of kidding. Because when Ronald Reagan was criticizing Tip O'Neill for being shaped like Pac-Man and gobbling up money, taxpayer money, he said it with a wink. And Tip O'Neill was the first person at his bedside after he was shot, after that assassination attempt. And he knelt and said the 23rd Psalm with Ronald Reagan. Like, they didn't actually hate each other. I thought that's what we were doing. I thought it was like, wink, wink, politics ain't beanbag. This is fun. This is the way we talk. But there is a damage that can be done when you think, well, I'm going to operate and demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit, except in this realm. Mm-hmm. Like, you see business people do that, except financially. I'm going to make sure I do exactly what I want to make as much money as I humanly can. You see that in, terrible conditions for workers and stuff like that. Well, you can do that with politics too. And that's what I did. I was like, I'm a good moral person, but oh my gosh, wouldn't it be fun to, ameliorate like the goodness that people think towards Democrats who are doing good things? Why don't we just lessen that a bit and say, yeah, but aren't they nuts in the following ways? And so you've probably heard this term nut picking, but that's what I would do. This is a strategy.
Nut picking.
Yeah.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Okay. So there's a nut, say in Topeka, Kansas, who works at the DMV. And his name is Jason. Jason's going to do something stupid. And because of the nature of the internet, I'm going to find out about it. And I'm going to tell the whole world that Jason, who did this asinine thing, is indicative of the way Democrats are. This is just the way Democrats are. Aren't they crazy? If you want America to look like the DMV in Topeka, I've never been to Topeka, then you need to vote Democrats. But if you want an America that's different, then you need to, whatever.
Yeah.
But imagine the opposite of that. So you've got the media making fun of a person in Appalachia who's a Christian. Well, that's how Christians are. I would be offended by that. So anyway, when Donald Trump came down the escalator, I noticed in the furrowed brows of Americans that it wasn't delivered wink, wink. The acrimony was real. We hated each other. You can't live in Tennessee and not have a conversation with someone where they accuse Democrats of literally being demons. And I realized that I was wrong. I was the one that was pulling a lot of strings that shouldn't have been pulled. And honestly, I made a vow that I would no longer break the 10 commandments occupationally, which I was doing because I was bearing false witness against my liberal neighbor. I did not have any liberal neighbors, but if I did, I would have borne false witness against them. The guy in Topeka, Kansas is my neighbor. And so I decided not to bear false witness and not to lie. But that made me unemployable because I was a ghostwriter and a pundit, like facilitator for all of these very famous people. And I became unemployable. Like I started to push back and say, for example, I don't know, client 17, I don't think we should make fun of John McCain for heroically serving America in the military and becoming prisoner of war. And I just don't think that's funny. Do you think that's funny? I don't think that's what we do. Do we? And I would win at first because they trusted me because I was, their whisperer. But eventually they're like, look, we don't pay you to push back. We pay you to say what we want you to say in the best possible way. And they were right. They had every right to fire me. And I did get fired from some jobs, but I think I mostly quit. Sometimes it was hard to tell because I love my clients so much. It was horrible.
Yeah.
But when I refused to do what they needed me to do, it was understandable they wanted to get rid of me.
Was this a long process of where you got to that point of where you said, I'm no longer going to bear false witness? Or was there some single precipitating moment where that happened?
Well, I think I started recognizing it was long because you can't just switch parties. You can't just, and I didn't switch parties. I did drop out of the GOP. But it's such a foundational part of my identity. And everybody that I know is a Republican and everybody in the church is a Republican. So what are you going to do if you say no to that? But like I remember when Judge Moore in Alabama was running for Senate, and he was this big Ten Commandments guy, unconstitutionally so. And I would gently push back on my clients. Well, we should appreciate the Constitution. I think that we are pro-Constitution. Last I checked, that's what we believed. And and then later it was revealed he was this skis-ball sexual predator. But I saved the butts of my clients by encouraging them to embrace the Constitution back then and not endorsing that guy. But some of them did anyway, but I had nothing to do with that. But, eventually my credibility just was in the toilet because I don't, like you would think that would earn you credibility. Like, oh, good thing we dodged that bullet. But it doesn't matter. Roy Moore, nobody cares about Roy Moore. What they care about is if you're wearing the red hat, then you're part of the team. And if you don't put on the red hat, you're, just tossed away appropriately because I wasn't about that. So, I can't, it's not their fault that they needed to get rid of me.
So clearly that sort of being cast away, to use your language there, carries with it certain attendant pains, sense of alienation, hostility, I would imagine. I would also assume perhaps maybe old kind of notions of shame bubble up with that as well.
Yes, definitely. Not to mention financially, because I am a college dropout. I've dropped out of 3 colleges. And my husband, who is sometimes very rude, says that I might drop out of more because I am an ambitious person. But I don't have
that sounds just like something from Harvard, somebody from Harvard.
Somebody from Harvard. Yeah, they're snooty. You can't trust them. But I was unemployable. Because before I became a ghostwriter, I literally sold bicycles, and so I could not get a job because I was like, oh, I'm a writer. I've got 5 New York Times bestselling books. This is going to be easy. I'm going to just work for anybody who needs writing help. But you can't just apply to jobs. I mean, I applied to 50 million jobs and I got one curiosity call back. Like, what is wrong with you? What do you mean you want to write emails for our electric company CEO? I didn't even get that job. Lee, I am unemployable. This is my only thing. But it was so terrible. And also the thing that was hardest is because the people that I loved the most did not understand, do not understand to this day.
Yeah. So on that side is all of that pain. I would assume at the same time on the other side, there's a sort of clarification and liberation, freedom even, once you make a decision that you know where you stand and going to say what you're going to say.
Yeah, I think I would like to say that with a little more bravado than I feel. I feel mostly sad because I love everybody here.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've mentioned the word, I think, despondent 2 or 3 times today. So,
sorry, I need to increase my vocabulary.
Yeah, no,
that's the theme, my theme word.
I mean, the reason I raise that is because one of my questions was, are you tempted to despair, and how are you navigating that?
I am in so much despair. You can hear it in my voice. I'm so sad. And I don't navigate it. I just sort of wallow in it. I need to figure out a strategy. But there is no strategy. There is no strategy when I live in West Haven, which is this beautiful, wonderful place. It looks like Norman Rockwell created a subdivision. There are 60 botanists who tend to our flowers, pickleball, tennis, swimming. And I have this community that I love in West Haven. And if they did not have a Bible study where they invited a January 6ther to speak, not to repent, not to confess, not to say, I had a hard time of it, but to talk about how they were unfairly, prosecuted or whatever, they're political prisoners, whatever. And so my friends, there was a mayoral candidate in Franklin, Tennessee that hung out with Nazis, actual literal Nazis as bodyguards, and had a lot of other nefarious things. She lived in our subdivision. And so people would have her signs in their yards, my friends. And I was like, okay, I am not going to acquiesce. I'm not going to pretend that this is not a thing, because We live in the neighborhood. I have a child that is Black. Through adoption, we have our youngest child from Ethiopia. And so if my neighborhood is turned over to the Nazis, that's no good, right? And so I would talk to my friends and I'm like, hey, Bill, I know you're a good Christian man because you tell me all the time. What about this Nazi business in your front yard? Like, is this cool? Is this what we're doing? And his reaction was, well, the reason why I have to support this person is, and it usually had to do something with the gays. I really did not like it that our current mayor allowed the gays to have a parade or something like that. Once again, the Constitution plays, should have a role in our thinking here. But I would argue with this guy, and I said to him, I was like, I'm going to, every time that I see you for the rest of my life, I'm going to ask you about your Nazi affiliations. Okay, because this is not cool, right? And these are people that I love. I love all of these people, but I cannot. So I am so, you either have to turn off the part of your brain that thinks about politics and morality. You have to acquiesce and wear the red hat, or you're sort of socially awkward. So I've chosen the socially awkward thing, as you can probably tell. And I just make things uncomfortable. I can ruin a party in 3 words or less.
You tell how I'm trying to remember what you had been, what the context was. I don't remember, but at one point you say, I was so despondent, a friend of mine, a theologian, called to remind me that my job was never to exact justice. He reminded me that one day everything would be made right, justice would reign, and every tear would be dried, but today wasn't that today. Today, my only job was to remind people and myself that justice is coming and everything that has been lost will ultimately be restored. That's obviously grounded in a sort of theological conviction that I would assume most Jews and Christians and Muslims all would share that sort of conviction. But another way to describe, I think, what that paragraph says is that you still have a belief in the necessity and the power of truth-telling.
Yes. And that sounds so much better than me wallowing in my own despair, which is my current strategy. When I wrote that, I was probably stronger. But yes, my husband is a First Amendment attorney. He is an expert in free speech. And the problem with America and the Constitution and the First Amendment is not that our free speech rights are restricted, is that we don't have the guts to say what needs to be said because there's a social cost. And some people think they might lose their job or they might whatever. So, but we have a lot of robust protections of our speech. And so because we care about the First Amendment and because I think it's super important to participate in the marketplace of ideas, I want to speak. And I don't think as a mother that I could just let a lot of this stuff go. And as an American, as a patriotic American, you can't let this stuff go and act like it's cool to mock a prisoner of war. That should have been the deal breaker on this, but it wasn't, right? And so, yeah.
I mean, I think that what you just said there is worth ruminating on a bit longer. Our problem is not that our First Amendment rights have been curtailed, but that we don't have the guts to use that right to say what needs to be said.
Yes. And if there are conservatives listening, they're mad right now because every person that you talk to in the Republican Party will say, we are under attack. We cannot say anything without the government breathing down our neck. And you can see that. I did not watch 1 second of the inauguration, but I heard that he was like, in America, we use these pronouns or whatever. Everybody thinks that we're under attack in all of these ways. But the truth of the matter is that no people group in the history of the world has experienced and enjoyed a more robust protection for their speech in the history of the world, better than 5 years ago, better than 20 years ago. And I know this, I am a college dropout, because my husband is a First Amendment attorney. And ever since we've been married for 29 years, and the whole time that we've been married, he's been taking case after case after case and winning case after case after case, which sets precedent. So the media will tell you, and the people at church will tell you that you are, in danger of being imprisoned because you believe that men can't get pregnant. But that is not the case.
Yeah. It seems also that there does need to be a sharp distinction in our minds between the right to free speech that protects us from legal sanction and speech that has social costs. Those are two very different things, right? Like you're exercising your free speech, and you've made the choice, this is going to cost me socially.
Yeah.
But I'm going to exercise this right. I'm going to exercise this call to truth-telling, even though I know that it's going to cost me something.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I think I sort of overemphasized the fact that my clients had every right to fire me. Yeah. Because it wasn't a good fit. Yeah. Because like Hillary Clinton would not hire me to write her memoir. Yeah. And I would do it if she took a truth serum before. It'd be an amazing book. But I would not trust her to tell me the truth. But, she wouldn't seek me out because I'm not a Democrat, right? Yeah. So you want your ghostwriter to be your friend. But yes, there are consequences to speaking out. And the question is, what is your price? Is it like, what would it cost? What would someone have to pay you just to shut up? Yeah. And, honestly, when I was trying to get the job writing the emails for the CEO of the electric company and not being able to get hired, I realized it was a cost, because I don't have a lot to fall back on. Yeah. But I mean, I thought, and I still believe that the stuff that we're dealing with is actually stuff that we need to speak out on. I think that, like, one time, because of my job, I ended up on Trump's plane, his campaign plane. I was at a MAGA rally getting spat upon by people because I was in the roped off area for journalists. I was there with my client who was speaking on behalf of Donald Trump. And they would come over and just like spit at us and yell, F you, journalists and all this. And I was like, I am here with your people, But somebody came up to me, a friend of the client, and he was like, oh, the client wants you to come up and you can get a picture with Donald Trump. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was thinking, what do I do, right? And so and then, because I did not want history to remember that I was at this rally, as I'm telling America that I was at the rally. But he said, oh, but you should do this because you can show your grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh my gosh, my grandchildren are going to judge me in this moment, what I do. And, I have this kid, my third child who's adopted. I'll probably have grandchildren that are Black. And I'm going to show them this picture of me and Donald Trump? Absolutely not. So that's when I realized I was in the wrong place, not just geographically, but occupationally. And I needed to get out of there.
So you've kind of pointed us in this direction the last several minutes, but talk to us about how you would articulate an ethic of storytelling. What's the, especially as a ghostwriter, I mean, what do you see as the legit voice to take as a ghostwriter, and at what point you decide, no, I will not go there?
Well, I'm not ghostwriting anymore, and I would do it. I love it, and I love all my clients. I love hanging out. The thing about, because I switched from politics into the pure world of Hollywood. So I worked with like The Bachelor and like Kim Kardashian and stuff like that, which I totally love because I love reality TV. But you don't hold reality TV stars to the same standards that you hold members of the church or whatever. Yeah. So, and they were doing great stuff. Like Kim Kardashian was doing a lot of great criminal justice reform. Sean Lowe, The Bachelor, is amazing. Christian guy, love him to death. Had a lot of fun doing all that. But I think storytelling is so fundamentally amazing, and you're just casting a spell, And so the question that I ask is, can you tell the truth? So if you can tell the truth, do it for anybody. Yeah. I would do it for anybody. There was one instance, there was somebody who asked me to write, and a very famous person in prison. And I was doing some interviews with him in prison, and he seemed like he had a fascinating tale that needed to be told. But then I read a book written by the FBI that put him in prison, and I realized he may have killed 6 people. And I thought, the editorial process is difficult enough. I don't know if I want him to be mad at me. So I did not do that. But I think that if you can tell the truth, but the thing is with the politician stuff, you're not telling the truth. So if you're telling the truth and it's a good story, it's awesome. And you are fine to tell it. Like my story, it's not a story. My book is not a story of me behaving well. All stories are conflict, disappointment, bad decisions, or it's not interesting.
Yeah.
So the question is, are you trying to convince somebody that what you're doing is right and that you're really awesome or not? So in this book, I tried to be completely transparent. I did not try to elevate myself into anything that I wasn't. I wasn't trying to say, this is the way you should act, because I've never figured out how to act. But I think stories are good if they're true.
Yeah. What has the last decade done for your own sense of faith? Where are you with that? What's that like for you now?
I feel like I'm holding on to Christianity by my fingernails because the church is so disappointing over and over and over and over. And you leave the context of the Church of Christ where I was abused, and you go to the Presbyterian Church of America, which is the conservative branch of the Presbyterians, not the liberal Presbyterians, which obviously they would have problems. Here's the great church. And then you find out they have problems. And I'm not talking about, I don't like this hymn. I prefer pre-Civil War, whatever, which you hear a lot. And I love that kind of church drama. At my old church, there was a Fannie J. Crosby hate club because she was too sentimental. And she's like this blind hymn writer. It's like, how can you hate this person? But I was there for it. I love all kinds of church drama. But I'm talking about serious overlooking of abuse over and over. And not just overlooking it, but like Donald Trump would not be president if the church did not want Donald Trump to be president. That's just the facts. There's no way to spin it. Why did they want Donald Trump to be president when we had other options in the GOP primary? The list is long. So I've been very dejected and demoralized, and I don't know how to function exactly with the church because I love the church. As much as I poke fun of it, I loved going to church 3 times a week. I loved that my dad talked so much that they had to turn out the lights for us to leave. I loved the little old ladies who brought me casseroles when I was sick, and the ones who, when I made the honor roll, would cut out the little thing in the newspaper and bring it laminated. Who does that? People in the Church of Christ did. And I love those ladies. They had blue hair. Whatever. At my church in Paris, Tennessee, I had a gun safety class. Like, that's weird. I love stuff like that. And I can overlook all kinds of stuff because I myself am so deeply spiritually flawed. My thing is, how do you go to a church where they're worshiping the pastor who's abusing kids and they don't hold anybody accountable? You can't do that. So I don't know how to navigate that, but I anticipate that I will figure it out. Maybe in the next few years. But currently, I have to sort of force myself to go to church and force myself to, like at one point, I was actually talking to a pastor who's in our neighborhood, and I was like, every time I read the Bible, it sort of makes me sick. Like, I don't like the way a Bible looks. It's so floppy and limp, and the pages, you can see through them. Why? Why is it like that? I hate it. And he was like, maybe you just stop reading it. And I was like, okay. Probably wasn't reading it much, actually. But I took a year off, and I was like, I'm not going to feel guilty. But I've read the Bible now 4 times. So I was like, I'm just not going to do this anymore. And it gave me the permission to sort of grieve what I've lost.
Yeah.
And I think all of America is losing something as it pertains to church. I think a lot of people have that hole in their heart where church used to be. And it's really sad. So I have no answers.
Yeah.
When I figure them out, though, I'll come back.
Yeah.
Let you know.
Yeah. I'm laughing internally because my wife looked at me in bed 2 nights ago and she said, "What's that book you're reading?" And I said, "It's a new little trimline New Testament." I decided I was going to read the New Testament again because it's been a long time. And for very similar reasons to yours. It's kind of like, I do think for some of us, we get to this point of where anything affiliated with the tradition, it triggers things in us, right? And she laughed and she said, "Well, I'm glad to see that." It was very clear she hadn't seen it in a while, you know. So yeah.
And were you able to pay attention to the words and feel them anew, or did you find yourself scanning it like, "Ugh, okay?
I'm I'm only my plan is just to work through the New Testament this year.
Yeah.
So I'm taking it slowly, but I think that it's been so long since I have read the narratives, through, that it's hitting me with some freshness.
Yeah.
With both things that I'm uncomfortable with and things that are refreshing,
Yeah.
which I think probably is the way any kind of sacred text reading is supposed to hit you.
Right.
But anyway, so thank you for sharing that. What would you say, kind of for our last question? It seems that one of the things that you have had to do and that you're doing in the book is that you're trying. Maybe I would summarize it this way: you had these repeated episodes in which you felt othered, or you felt not accepted or rejected, a lack of understanding or a lack of love. And then you've had these experiences where you have had that in some cases, but you've also had the repeated occasions of rejection. And it seems to me that one of the things that you seem to be carrying out of that is your own sort of attempt not to demonize, and your own sort of attempt to try to understand people where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So what's that been like for you? And how would you encourage others to perhaps lean into that sort of approach to the world?
Okay. So after the Republicans turned on me and they started making fun of me for being abused, I decided that I was over those people. And I never followed Democrats on Twitter or any social media platform, because why would I want to know what they think? But I decided in that moment that I was going to follow anybody who said something nice to me about this article. So there was this lady named Kathy Kattenberg, and she was like, Nancy, I disagree with your husband and you politically, but you're very brave to share that. And I clicked follow. I didn't know if she was real. She had an immigrant image on her her handle. I thought she was probably a bot, whatever. And over the course of the next few months, I noticed that this woman did not like my husband at all. And so but I was like, okay, but she was nice to me this one time. This is going to be great. But she would post on there with David French, maybe you should take a back seat and stop talking about issues since you know nothing about Jews, or you don't know anything about Black people. So sit down, and your racist policies, or how dare you be pro-life? I've had 4 abortions, and I don't want to have you telling me what to do with my body and all this stuff. And I mean, she hated David, and she wrote something. There was not a post where she did not say something to David French. Hated him. And so COVID hit, and I have this rule that if I see someone who's in duress, I at least try to help. So she posted something on Twitter, and she goes, I will never get food again. This is impossible. She lived in New York. And the deliveries for groceries were obviously complicated. So I just thought, oh my gosh, I have this rule. And this Kathy Kattenberg lady, who seems like she's a little unhinged in her hatred toward my family, might need food. So I messaged her, and I was like, I'm David French's wife, Nancy. I've been following you for several months. This is my phone number. Are you okay? And my phone rings. Like it's 1996. Like, who calls, right? And so I just was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to talk to. She's obviously not a bot, but what is she going to be like? So I pick up the phone. She has this New York accent, and I sound like I fell off a turnip truck. And she was like, yes, I am actually disabled, and I can't leave the house. And I normally do Instacart, but because everybody's doing Instacart, I paid the money for my groceries and they never came. So I don't have any money to eat. I've been eating pancake mix for like 6 weeks. And I was like, oh my gosh, Kathy, what do we need to do? I don't even know what to do. So I called, she was Jewish. So I called all the synagogues, and they were not about it because everybody needed food. I called the Presbyterians. They weren't about it. They couldn't do anything. I thought about driving up there, but I literally could not get her food. I placed an Amazon order like for Whole Foods. I did an Instacart order. I did like an Aldi's thing. But every day I would talk to Kathy Kattenberg, this person who hated us, on the phone. And something breaks in your heart when she tells you that she likes all these chicken chimichangas. and this certain type of toilet paper, it breaks your heart because you suddenly are not talking about abortion.
Yeah.
And so I was like, Kathy, I'm going to do anything. If I have to drive there, I will. I'm going to bring you food. So I place all these orders. Day after day passes. On the third day, I think, that sounded like I borrowed that from the Bible, so it might have been the fourth. We still hadn't gotten it. And I was like, Kathy, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to get you food. I think only thing we need to do is pray. And she goes, okay, pray. And I was like, how dare you ask me to pray? I'm not praying with you. I don't pray out loud. I don't pray with David. I'm not about to be praying for anybody. And she was like, well, you said we needed to pray. And I was like, well, how did Jews pray? You do it. And she was like, I don't want to do it. And I was like, oh my gosh, Kathy, I do not want to pray with you. And she was like, just do it. And I said, well, I pray in the name of Jesus. Is that going to break something? And she was like, no, just do it. So I was like, okay. And I was like, dear God, get this woman some bananas, like whatever, in the name of Jesus, and it was just like so stupid. It was so dumb. But I swear to you, Lee, I'm not making this up. Within 30 minutes, all of these orders start coming in. So she literally had like 30 bananas. She's a single woman. She had 6 pounds of beef. A pastor in our neighborhood sent her 30 cans of diced tomatoes. I mean, it was like the lady was rich with food. Anyway, and so in that process, she was like, Nancy, why did you help me? And I was like, I don't know, Kathy. Jesus. Like that's what the thing is. He says that you're supposed to take care of people in duress, whatever. So that's the reason. And she was like, okay, well, whatever. I appreciate it. Okay, well, I appreciate you. And eventually all of that turned into, I love you. We're still friends to this day. This woman is freaking amazing. She's brilliant. She's thoughtful. She's conscientious. She has so many wonderful ideas. And she opened up my eyes to what it was like to actually be friends with somebody who is ideologically different. She hasn't changed one bit. But I did ask her about her abortions, and she told me the stories, and it was heartbreaking. And she was like, why aren't you judging me about that? And I'm very pro-life. We had a situation where my daughter had a baby, and they said the baby was going to be disabled probably permanently, 24/7 care. And Kathy and I talked about that. And she was like, well, if you need abortion advice, let me know. And I was like, I love you, Kathy, but I don't. What? We've been talking all this time. This is not what we do. So we had these funny misunderstandings and funny conversations. And sometimes we would watch Tim Keller sermons and she would disagree with them or like them or whatever. But I just started developing relationships with people outside the church, people who were kind, people who, Kathy's, she was not incredibly kind. But she said, Nancy, I'm so sorry that I treated your family this way. And since then, we've actually gone to visit with her, and she's gone to hear my stories, and she's, I just love the woman so much, and she loves me. And so that's the type of thing that never would have happened if I had not decided to quit looking at the world through my lens of tribalism.
Been talking to Nancy French, discussing her most recent book, her personal memoir, Ghosted, An American Story. Nancy, thanks. It's been a delight to be with you today.
Thank you so much.
Hey there, it's Lee. If you're listening to No Small Endeavor, I know you have probably asked yourself, what does it mean to live a good life? Well, sometimes living a good life requires change, but can people really change? That's the question at the heart of the new season of Love Letters from the Boston Globe. Each episode, advice columnist Meredith Goldstein explores real stories of transformation, resilience, and growth. You'll laugh, cry, and learn as guests share their journeys through major life changes, the mending of broken bonds, and the hard-earned lessons of personal evolution. This season features special guests like Dr. Stephen Hyman, a leading brain expert from the Broad Institute, and Under the Tuscan Sun author Frances Mace. Listen or watch the new season of Love Letters from the Boston Globe wherever you get your podcasts. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carrie Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, Tim Lauer, and Jonas Litton at Wise Company Studios. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.